Hi everyone, welcome to the session of our web series, Fireside Chat with Champions, in which we interview global business leaders, asking them crowdsourced questions relevant to the biggest challenge we face today, COVID-19 and its impact on various aspects of business as well as society, and the way we can steer ourselves in current uncertainties. Today we have with us super special person, Michele Wucker. While she needs no introduction, but still for the sake of audience who would be overwhelmed, I will try. Michele is an author, commentator, and a policy analyst specializing in the world economy and crisis anticipation. She is the author of The Grey Rhino, How to Recognize and Act on the Obvious Dangers We Ignore. Lockout, Why America Keeps Getting Immigration Wrong When Our Prosperity Depends on Getting It Right. And Why the Cocks Fight, Dominicans, Haitians, and the Struggle for Hispaniola, sorry, I'm not that great in those pronunciation. All our books have received praise from business, policy, and thought leaders around the world and influenced policy debates at the highest level. I've been part of some of those debates, and believe me, her thoughts, her concept has actually been pretty handy whenever we talk about crisis. An award-winning global thought leader with experience in strategy, immigration policy, finance, globalization, turnarounds, and crisis management, Michele draws her expertise from her 3 decades of work in media, non-profit management, and policy development. She has been recognized as a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, among other honors. Her previous leadership positions included Vice President for Studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, President of the World Policy Institute. In fact, she had been one of the biggest impact on that institute because the perception about that institute changed once she joined, and Latin American Bureau Chief at the International Financing Review. Michele founded Grey Rhino and Company in 2015 to help leaders and organizations to identify and strategize responses to Grey Rhino risks that are neglected despite and all too often because of this size. Thanks, Michele, for accepting our invitation. I would request you to let our viewers know a bit more about you and your current interests and activities. It's an honor to have you here. Floor is yours, Michele.
Thank you. It's an honor to be invited. Really happy to participate. I'm continuing to do a lot of work on applying the Grey Rhino concept and a 5-stage framework. There's really a theory about why it takes people so long to deal with obvious things. And there are different stages of a Grey Rhino crisis, and each one has its own obstacles and strategic opportunities. So helping corporations and trade groups to apply that in their work. I'm actually working on a new book right now, which comes from the conversations I've had all around the world about the book that have surprised me. That I wrote the book as a policy and finance and business strategy person, and so many people have asked, how do I apply this to my personal life? And some people have even told me I am applying this to my personal life already, which has been this sort of organic response and just amazing to me. So that led me to ask questions about why does each one of us come to our own approach to risk-taking, to dealing with risks, to heading off dangers? How do we deal with the Grey Rhinos in our life? So this the sequel that I'm working on right now is much more psychological. It goes into cultural influences. Why do individuals, organizations, and countries and societies respond the way they do to risk and to the obvious dangers around them? And as we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, countries around the world have responded in completely different ways. Groups within countries have responded in very different ways. So it's a very, very timely way to be thinking about what leads us to behave the way that we do in face of these obvious Grey Rhino dangers that are coming at us.
That's awesome. And believe me, on the personal front, at the level of regions, at the level of country, we want you to write something because it's very, very critical, because the way we reacted, right, to the pandemic we saw today, or we are seeing today, could have been very, very different if people would have listened to your advice long back. Like you've been talking about few things for nearly, I'm saying that half a decade now. And unfortunately, the way the policymakers behave, God knows, but if they could have taken inputs from you, I believe we could have saved lives. So thanks, Michele. This brings us to our first question. You coined the term Grey Rhino in a presentation at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos in 2013. and subsequently also wrote your third book with the same title. Unlike previously used and highly improbable black swan, popularized by Mr. Taleb's 2007 book, grey rhino are highly probable, high impact, yet very, very neglected threats. Do you think we can call COVID-19 as a grey rhino? And if you think it does, can you guide us how it is in sync with your concept?
Absolutely. Well, the pandemic is a grey rhino actually in two different ways. There's something I call a recurring rhino, which is like financial crisis or pandemics, the things that happen somewhat regularly over the course of time. We don't know exactly when they're going to happen or what exactly the form is that they're going to take, but we can be pretty sure that it's going to happen. And there have been many, many warnings that another pandemic was coming. And that the world was not prepared, and we didn't pay attention to those. The grey rhino is a thing that's obvious and probable. Unlike its cousin, the elephant in the room, which normalizes the idea of not saying and not doing anything. The grey rhino is dynamic, and it gives you a challenge. It's a thing that people are talking about, and some people are doing something about, but generally it's just not enough. My great-grandfather died in the second wave of the 1918 flu pandemic. So on a certain level, this speaks to me personally. But so we knew that another pandemic was coming, and many smart people warned about it, and we weren't ready. So in this sort of bigger picture, this sort of recurring rhino framework, we just were not paying attention. But then once the information came out, it took China a little while to figure out what was going on and the extent of the seriousness of it. But the rest of the world had sort of a preview, watching what was happening in China and then watching what was happening in Italy. And so this was the grey rhino that's right in front of you, that's getting ready to charge. And the United States in particular, and I certainly think some European countries as well, missed opportunities to make sure that there was an adequate supply of masks for healthcare workers, adequate supply of personal protective equipment. There have been so many studies saying, if you had started shelter in place, 3 days earlier or a week earlier, whatever, we would have saved X thousand cases and however many lives. It's very hard to tell what exactly it would be, but I think it's very clear that if we had started to act sooner, we wouldn't be seeing the depths of the crisis that we are, and particularly in the United States. And I do want to say also about the pandemic that there were many, many problems that were already there. They were the other grey rhinos, and I think that the pandemic has made a lot of those much clearer. Inequality, climate change, financial fragilities that are stemming from extremely loose monetary policy over the last 10 years, and increasing inequality. So we'll also have a number of grey rhinos that have both been uncovered and have been spawned by the pandemic that we'll be seeing over the coming months and years, which are quite daunting as well.
That's great articulation. In fact, I happened to have a chance, or I'll say that misfortune, that actually I was in a place called Chitwan in Nepal, and suddenly rhino appears from somewhere. And actually I video recorded that. And believe me,
I saw that video. It's so great. You should include the video in this. with the closing credits, your rhino video.
So in fact, you'll be surprised if I basically, when I see COVID and that scenario and your concept, believe me, there also it is high impact event, because actually rhino has been responsible for injuring a lot of people in that market. Secondly, it is very highly probable, because rhino do venture very, very regularly, and it is totally neglected because there is no protection. Same is what happened in the COVID. So believe me, people are able to connect with your book at very, very, I'm saying that DD level. Only thing is that those who don't know about that concept, they are not able to I'll say that use the knowledge to help themselves. I believe a lot of people should read that book and start applying it in their policy making, in their businesses, as well as in their personal life. So that brings us to actually our second question. Interesting is the fact that the term grey rhino became highly popular when it was on the front page of editorial on the official Chinese newspaper, the People's Daily, to describe a shift in their own policy. And subsequently, the New York Times also put it on their front page to reference the same shift. As you can see, COVID-19, which started from China, is impacting every country and every sector very, very differently. What policy shifts and structural change in the globalization do you see happening going forward due to this high impact yet initially neglected crisis?
Well, it's such a good and complex question that, of course, has been a debate for quite some time and is taking on completely new forms. And it's been quite troubling to me, actually, that the response to this crisis actually needs to be more cooperation globally. And instead, we're seeing countries pull into themselves, more nationalism, more chest thumping and drum beating, which really frightens me to a large extent. Lack of trust between countries. So I think we really need to be aware of that gray rhino, this nationalist gray rhino. And there are many people around the world who are aware and concerned. My friend Jamie Metzel in New York has recently started a movement called One Shared World to try to raise attention about the importance of global interdependence, that it's not just every country for themselves. Is what one country does affects other countries, and when other countries are doing better, so do we. It reminds me also of the Great Depression and some of the events that made that worse. And very similarly, you had economic shock in that case caused by a market collapse, which is not the case now, and which is a whole other problem, which I could go into. But you saw people responding to that with trade protectionism, with sort of beggar thy neighbor policies that actually made the Great Depression worse and ended up leading to the Second World War. So we need to be very aware of that. Trade is a big focus of that, and we've seen a lot of supply chain shocks. And I think companies and governments are aware of the danger of having a majority of your supply chain in one place. Now that actually cuts both ways, because it also means you don't want to have everything at home, because if your home market gets clobbered and you can't produce things, that's not helpful either. So on trade, I think we need to be looking at diversification across countries of sources. So in some cases, that might actually mean more of your business should shift to overseas suppliers. The other part of it is the climate change angle. I'm very, very much opposed to trade restrictions that are done for political purposes and are just counterproductive, and particularly when they're done through chest thumping as opposed through serious adult negotiations. But I do think we need to be paying more attention as a planet to the transportation costs of the goods that we use. And so I would be in favor of tariffs that are calibrated to the environmental impact of goods. And that could also mean that a country that has greener energy policies could actually benefit from that. So there's, I think, an opportunity perhaps to get the nationalists who want trade barriers no matter what together with the climate change people, so that the nationalists get some trade barriers, but they can be done in a way that is productive. That your higher taxes on things that have a negative impact, such as the fossil fuel use, and lower tariffs on things that have a social good. So I think there are ways that we can rethink how globalization is done. The other part about globalization is it's not just the shift of goods and services where they're being made. It's the fact that has accompanied tax policies and other policies that have contributed to huge wealth inequality. That's the problem. It's not the globalization in and of itself. So I think that if you address the wealth inequality issues, of course, globalization has made that top percent that much richer. If you find ways to address that, you are also going to find ways to address the tensions over globalization. And so it's a whole series of challenges. And I like solutions that solve more than one problem at once. So it broadens your constituency for the solution, particularly if you have something like climate change that is politicized.
Right. Now that's great articulation of, as you said, like, the gray rhino issue, which we are currently facing. I would like to add up a small question just to what you have said. See, chest thumping, Uber nationalization, right? This is what we are seeing that very common now. Just 5 or 6 or 7 years back, it was not that common. People were still like, bought to the idea that can we fine-tune globalization to make world a better place by ensuring the gender neutrality or like, equality in the incomes, right? More inclusiveness from the developing world. So those things were being tackled. But suddenly you are having now like, I won't say that rightist, but I'm saying close to rightist leaders suddenly coming and saying that I want everything to be local, but I want FDI, right? So that dichotomy, how do you see that, like, the politics impacting even where we are tackling the basic problems we face as humanity, whether it's about COVID or a climate change?
It's so interesting. There's a new book that's just out by Michael Pettis and Matthew Klein called Trade Wars or Class Wars that talks about the class and inequality implications of trade policy. And it's very interesting to see that as countries are trying to bring more production back to their own countries, that's going to force them to deal with a lot of class issues. It's going to raise prices of a lot of goods, which is going to hurt people who are most price sensitive, who have the least amount of disposable income and discretionary income. It's going to affect, labor costs. I think a lot of these countries are going to try to automate as much as possible to reduce the labor costs. And that gets into a whole other discussion about the impact of technology in general on society, on the economy. Kai-Fu Lee has written and spoken very, very eloquently about this. You've got technology companies that are able to make higher and higher profits with fewer and fewer employees and less capital, but these sort of social externalities that they are creating have not been addressed yet, are not taxed properly, and that they're making astronomical profits, but are not paying for the outside damage that they're doing. Bill Gates has talked about, what if we tax robots? You've seen people talking about universal basic income for people who've been, particularly, I think, aimed at people displaced by jobs. I think universal would be very, very difficult, but I think if you can do sort of, targeted incomes towards people who have been affected, and also, as Kai-Fu Lee talks about, find ways to better monetize the human skills that are the most valuable, but whose monetary value doesn't reflect that. The caregiving, the artistic, the cultural things. So I think we need a very, very big rethink of the social contract, between companies, citizens, and governments. And that's something that every country needs to think about. Whenever you see these surges of nationalism and blaming immigrants or ethnic minorities or blaming trade partners, it's usually a symptom of some other problems that are there. And I wrote about this in my first book, Why the Cockfight, which was about the Dominican Republic and Haiti, technically, but it's really about other things. This cockfight metaphor came from the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who had this wonderful essay, Notes on a Balinese Cockfight, who talked about the cockfight being basically a shadow play to dramatize the conflicts between the humans, so humans didn't come to blows over their problems. And so I use that as a metaphor for nationalism, for immigrant scapegoating. And when I wrote the book, it came out just over 20 years ago, which is a little hard to believe now. I was talking at the time about the breakup of Yugoslavia and other issues at that time. But it's really struck me how timely that is today, and how we are seeing very, very bad mismanagement in the United States. We're seeing tensions in other countries that politicians are trying to deflect people's attention from by blaming China, blaming other countries that are, making goods that people are buying, blaming immigrants. And that is not going to end well. In Lockout, I wrote about how those attitudes were hurting the skill sharing among the best and brightest among the world. They were hurting trade. They were really hurting the basic mechanisms of the global economy, but also national economies. So I think it's very, very important in the context of the pandemic, this sort of gray rhino, to not forget this other animal metaphor, the cockfight, the deflection of attention to get people to forget about the really big mistakes that are being made.
Now, I'm pretty sure that all the 3 books which you have written should be part of the curriculum of any political science student, right? That gives a very, very awesome worldview, and it makes you understand why few things happen the way they have happened so far. So that's a brilliant articulation in all the 3 books. That brings us to something which is like, I'll say that we all are facing or seeing every day when we pick up a newspaper. So let me little bit phrase it. While we have seen the consequence COVID-19 activities by a lot of countries, where the pressure of all sorts, from health diplomacy to economical perception building to harsh statement at the state level, state heads level, coming against China, right? China also did its own things by sometimes being very offensive, sometimes being a little bit considerate in their own diplomacy. Being someone who has an excellent understanding of globalization and crisis management, can you shed some light on how the China and the rest of the world equation will look like going forward?
It's obviously a topic that's very very dear to me because I've had such wonderful experiences in China because they've embraced and applied my ideas. For some time now in the United States, among the sort of policy literati world, there's been this argument that conflict was inevitable because when a sort of waning, aging power sees a rising power, they feel defensive, and that's going to create problems. China has risen very, very quickly over a period of decades, has brought so many people out of poverty. I've found has a much more forward-looking approach to financial risk, to some of these other gray rhino risks. So I think that for a country that's not dealing with its own issues, a country that is moving forward is going to be a threat. I think that in the United States, there have been a number of policy mistakes and a lot of financial fragilities that make the current administration more likely to blame other countries. Now, no country in the world is perfect. And I think that the international community can have issues with any number of things in any country in the world, but I don't think that whatever the foreign policy establishment says, I don't think that conflict with China is inevitable. I think that there are a lot of people who over the years have been part of the economic interdependence between the United States and China, who've had experience with real people in China and realize that the picture that is being painted in the United States right now is not necessarily accurate, not the whole picture. And interestingly, in Europe, there's been a change of attitude. There was a recent poll in Italy of which country Italians would prefer to have a long-term partnership with. And more people chose China than the United States. Now, we're at a very particular time in the United States where many of us here don't recognize this country, that the current administration is not respecting some of the key values that Americans have. And I'm certainly hoping that changes. And I think that that an administration that's really focused on recognizing and managing obvious problems will deal in a much more responsible way with its relationship with China and with the rest of the world, because it's not just China that the United States has been picking a fight with.
Right. No, I agree with you. Like, China has been pretty progressive in understanding a lot of gray rhinos. One example I would give you that actually I see in a lot of hotels and restaurants, they started using robots just a couple of years back. And I was surprised and asked him, like, one of a very good friend who is a very senior industrialist in China, I said, you guys, what you are going to achieve? You are having such a population, employ them. He said, Deepak, this is what you'll need pretty soon. And he gave a smile. And now I recall it, believe me, actually, like, if we would have had hotels with robots without physical contact, those hotels would have been open by now. In fact, Alibaba is putting a restaurant which have no waiter to serve you. Those restaurants would become so relevant today. So I strongly believe that yes, China understands gray rhinos better than the rest of the world. So now I would as we are coming to the last section of our discussion, this is something which is silver bullets we need from you, being entrepreneurs, being startup owners. We are the people who are at, I'm saying that harm's way the first, because we have smaller lungs, right? We don't have capacities like big corporation to keep oxygen till the water recedes. We are in it. We would like to understand from you, based on your experience, that what are the 3 or 4 things we should be doing, or to ensure that we survive. Because believe me, world needs us. It's not just us. We employ the maximum number of people. We ensure the prosperity of the people. Large corporation, again, I'm not against them, but they have their own way of doing, as you were saying, that they employ robots, but end of the day, they make more money. It's the SME and the startups which employs maximum number of people. So for us to survive, we need guidance from you that what we should do, so that next 6 months, 8 months, a year, we're still there surviving.
It's interesting. It's such a different challenge for every business, because different industries have been hit very differently, by this. One of the big things that I've been thinking and having conversations about lately is this sort of gray rhino culture. The risk taking that companies are comfortable with, the risk responses. When they see the gray rhino coming with, what are they doing about it? And small and medium enterprises, I think, have an easier time with the challenge of cultural change. If there's something that needs to be changed, there are fewer people, it's less complex. It's probably much clearer, what the CEO's attitudes are towards dealing with obvious risks or not, how conservative they are, how aggressive they are. So the first thing is really to understand your organizational culture. Are you the kind of company that sees a problem and says, okay, let's think about how we can solve the problem? Or are you the kind of company that says, oh, well, this is how things have always been done, and this is how we're going to do it? A lot of family companies have that issue, particularly around technology change, around older generations wanting to sort of steady the course, to be conservative in a certain way. And the younger generations are more concerned with the possibility of that way of business becoming obsolete. So for family businesses in particular, there's the question of balancing generational attitudes towards risk. What are the biggest risks, and what are you going to do about them? Because we forget that so many people see trying to deal with a risk as being risky in and of itself. They're more afraid of doing the wrong thing than of doing nothing. So understanding your basic starting point in dealing with some of those things, and having people around you with different perspectives, making sure you're getting good input and good decisions. So that's the one side, understanding your culture and compensating when you need to. The other part is really on the policy side, that, big businesses have the best paid lobbyists and the most influence with governments. And small and medium enterprises have more strength in numbers in, working together. So I think there should be much more coordination among small and medium enterprises to push governments to meet their needs more, and particularly the very smallest businesses in terms of access to capital. They have a much harder time getting access to the capital that they need. The big companies are deemed to be lower risk. They've got more reserves. They can borrow at lower rates. But in many cases, these giant companies are the ones that are introducing systemic risks into the economy. So I think we need to rethink this whole question about risk pricing and access to capital. And when governments think about the contribution that small and medium enterprises make in terms of creating new jobs, of innovation, of really driving the economy, I think there should be a lot more support to small and medium enterprises. And the only way you're going to get that is by working together so that your voice is louder than that of the companies with the best paid lobbyists.
Awesome advice. Be collaborative, coordinate with each other, and ensure you work as a herd rather than individuals. Great advice. Michele, thanks a lot. I just love this conversation. I learned definitely a lot, and audience will also be learning a lot of new things from you. In fact, I believe every startup also should go through your book before they start thinking about the risk and how to they should forge ahead in their activities. And maybe someday I'll co-author a book with you on application of Grey Rhino for startup and small and medium businesses. Thanks a lot.
Or even a video.
It was a pleasure talking to you, and I love this chat really. As a fan, actually, definitely I was overwhelmed. I'm losing my word. That's the aura you are having. Thanks a lot for being on this session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Stay safe.